Matt, in the humanities, we are currently looking at Sophocles' famous play, Oedipus Rex. And as a professor of literature, what sorts of things should the students pay attention to when they approach this play?
Well, I think the first thing to consider before you dive too deeply into the text is to think about the historical environment that a piece of literature is produced in. Not that gives you every piece of insight that you need, but it can be very helpful. And so when we think about Sophocles and about Oedipus Rex in particular, the Greek theater environment was integral to the culture of Greek society. So when we say that the Greeks would put on a play, it wasn't like we might think of plays today where only specific people ever go to the theater, and it's not a very mainstream kind of art form, you might say. Everybody in the city went to the theater productions. They were massive cultural engagements, which could be as many as 15,000 people in a stadium watching a play. I mean, imagine, out on the west side near our school at the hockey arena, that being filled with people watching a play, a Greek tragedy, with no microphones, mind you, right? So, I mean, these people they're excited about going to these plays, and it's almost culturally expected of them, because these plays, these gatherings are where culture is shared. And that is just something that we here in our 21st century, that it's almost foreign to us. We don't live that way anymore, where everyone has their own device for watching movies, or there's just, you get fed what you want. There's really very little shared culture anymore, which is sad. Which is why in the humanities we talk so much about sharing culture. In English, in communication, we're studying media. Like, these are things that we need to be a part of. We all need to be talking about the same things when it comes to our culture. Otherwise, how do we know how to act towards one another? Well, back then, plays were one way that people in the city could get together and be entertained, yes, but also it was a method of learning as well. These plays are very didactic, as all literature is. It's not just entertainment, it's instruction. It's inculcating cultural values, actually, whether you realize it or not, they're in there. And so you get these crowds of people all attending these productions and hearing the same stories and then talking about them, and the plays reflecting the people and the people reflecting the plays. And there's a shared history that then is built upon in these cities. And that's the environment of these productions. And we have these authors like Sophocles, like Aeschylus, these prolific playwrights who write dozens and dozens of plays over the course of decades. And they have contests every year for the best plays. And, theater is an integral part of the Greek experience.
I think I read that at one point they required people.
Yeah, right.
Because in Athens they had democracy,
Yeah.
and you were supposed to improve your mind because you were serving in government in some way. And so this was an opportunity to learn something, to learn from someone else's example.
Right.
So you didn't suffer from the same tragedy.
Yes. Which is what literature is supposed to be, right? Not to get too far into the science of literature, but that is what literature does. Any narrative actually triggers in your brain a version of that experience, which is amazing. It's what makes us human. It's maybe the most valuable thing our brains even do, is let us play out fictional representations of the world so that we can learn from it and decide, well, was that a good choice? Was that a bad choice? How might I live my life differently, etc. And so, yeah, the people of the city expected everyone to participate in that.
So Matt, we've looked at some of the history behind the play and the historical context. What comes next?
Well, for me, I think you go right to the text. You always start with, what do the words on the page say? And for students who are tackling this perhaps for the first time, there are some basic elements that are not easy to start with, but I think that we all should be able to catch when we read this play. Things like noticing how often certain words are used. You can even keep track or highlight how often the word see or sight is there. A word like blind, light, darkness, those kinds of words that have to do with vision. They show up throughout the whole play. Anytime a word is repeated a lot in any sort of piece of literature, you should have red flashing lights going off going, this is important. You should watch this. And so that, noticing that motif of light and dark and vision and sight leads us to some of the main themes of the story, which is when we say we see something, do we actually see it? Do we understand it? Do we know what it is? And so we have these characters here who play off the irony of that vision motif, right? So we've got, a guy like Tiresias who's blind, yet he's the smartest guy. We've got Oedipus who has full sight, and yet he doesn't know what's going on. By the end, when he does know what's going on, now he's blind. So we have the motif leads to the various themes that are the ultimate kind of message of the story. So that's something that is pretty basic that students should be able to spot as they're going through the text. There's other ironies as well where that you should look for, where knowledge usually is a good thing, and yet throughout the play, every reveal of knowledge almost ends up being a bad thing. Knowledge should be enlightenment, and it ends up being punishment. Oedipus himself, he's tasked with finding the killer, right? He's the investigator, so to speak, but he's also the perpetrator. He's the criminal. So he's playing this dual role. He's fearful that Creon is manipulating him, and that he's trying to overthrow him, or that he'll become the leader. By the end of the story, he is the leader. So there's all these turns of almost like dualism. Like they're these doubles that if you keep track of them, like you'll see them happen over and over again, which lends to the kind of the brilliance of Sophocles, that he can create and structure this play with all these opposites happening at once, and it still makes sense. It's quite ingenious.
Yeah.
I know you found a few other examples of those ironies or those doubles, I think.
Right. So some scholars point to the fact that he's called the first of men.
All right.
But then he's the most accursed of men.
Sure.
He's the hunter and the prey. He's, like you said, the investigator and the criminal. He's the accuser and ends up becoming the defendant.
Right.
But perhaps the most interesting is he's both brother and father to his daughters.
Yes.
And son and husband to his mother.
Right. Which gets to the weirdness of the play, which we can tackle in some of the bigger ideas. But those opposites, the fact that there's always more going on in life than we think or at first appearance. And that's something that is we can take as a universal theme, right? That we don't know everything. In fact, we all have multiple sides to us, and often we don't know it, or we aren't aware of it, and that unawareness can lead to our downfall, which we can get to further on. But those are all important thematic ideas that can be found just by close reading. We also have, the idea of the story itself. This is a plot that the people in the audience would have already known, actually, the basic outline of it. This is a very, very old story, even older than the ancient Greek. So that creates something interesting for the audience as well, and for Sophocles as the author, where you have to think, okay, I'm writing this story or creating this play. My audience already knows how all this is going to play out. So how do I tell a story that provides tension and entertainment value, or suspense that makes my viewers want to keep watching this thing, and yet still have people be emotional about it and engaged in it, even though they know the ending? Hitchcock used to have an example where, he would say, the filmmaker, he would say, if you had a story, a scene playing out on camera, and the characters are talking to each other. They're going on as if nothing is out of the ordinary. And all of a sudden, a bomb goes off in the film. Well, that one instant is suspenseful because you don't know what's going on. It surprises the characters. Everything is now thrown into chaos. He said, but the way you add tension is, what if you have the characters in the film talking to each other and there's a bomb under the table and the camera shows it, so the audience knows there's a ticking bomb, and the characters don't know it. And so they think life is normal, but the audience now is on pins and needles for the whole scene. So you've created tension because the audience knows what's going to happen, even though the characters in the story don't. And so that sort of seems like what's happening here is Sophocles has to play with the tension of the story because his audience knows what's going to happen. And that takes an incredible talent of storytelling to get your characters, or your audience, to still want to invest in a story they already know is going to happen. So, and we can see because, again, if we know the plot, if we've read it, we know where this is going. And with each person who shows up in the play, with each new piece of information, Oedipus thinks it's going to go one way, and ultimately we go, oh, nope, he still doesn't get it. And so that's how the tension is built.